suppose, start from the beginning. So, Edward Lloyd, the figure that we're looking at tonight, is an individual that discovered the wonders of Allistic, the Allistic Pillar, which is to be found in a field on a mound from the Bronze Age. And the pillar itself was re-erected by Edward Lloyd in the late 1600s. We will be looking at this pillar and his translation of this monument. But on a backdrop of all this, we need to begin on 1588 with the translation of the Bible. One of the great tragedies with Camry is that very little was being written down across our land after the rebellion of Owain Glyndŵr, which ended around 1415. Very little was being written down. Poets were said not to write about the period of Owain Glyndŵr, and slowly but surely the culture started to disappear. Mainly a pastoral land with no rich endowments or affluent elite groups. This is not the land of England, over the border, over Offa's Dyke. This is a land with very little in the way of wonders. Most of the rich fixtures and fittings of the previous Welsh princes by the 1500s were gone. You think about Wales, you think about it wasn't the backwater, but it was. And when we're talking about the sense of a backwater, it wasn't until 1588 that a printed Bible came to the masses in a way. The Bible in the language of Kamri. That was in 1588. Of the books that were being printed, 115 books being printed over a period of 100 years, from 1546 to 1642. Those are the ones we know. 115 books, mainly in English. It's not a lot, actually, for 100 years. Only 67 of these were about topics in regards to history and its culture and poetry. The other half of the books were Bibles. So for 100 years, we don't have many books dedicated to recording the history and culture, the likes of those bards. The books of a religious nature are just repeating in either English or Welsh, published in Wales, the age-old stories of the New and the Old Testament. Those great stories about heroines and heroic epics are not really being written down in those books that are even printed that relate to anything other than the Bible. There are a few musical compositions and works relating to the arts, but this isn't a great deal in the form of literature being published. And it was after the 1640s that things started to change. Things started to be written down in other places, Peter. The heavy emphasis of the likes of the poets were to write them into manuscripts, and lots of them were never printed. And lots of that poetry recording the history was undoubtedly lost, because the printed word is the word that's being recorded and is the word that's taking over. It's described of those poets that they're unskilled, itinerant minstrels, otherwise known as the dung flies, with stories that the English elite were really not interested in, writing down on those manuscripts that didn't get into print. One of the great things is that with those manuscripts on vellum and parchment, they're not really surviving because they're rotting away. We don't have the great National Library that we see in latter years preserving things. Then we go into a more happy mode. We go into the later 1600s. Most of the academics are going to universities like Oxford and Cambridge. Now, why have I got an image which says the Chronicles of Ulster? Why is that relevant? It might be relevant to another part of Britain, but we'll go on to that in a short while. Another page of that Welsh translated Bible. Copies available in the National Library of Wales. But nevertheless, they're very rare. This is the man we're looking at today, Edward Lloyd. Now, anyone that would read about the old histories of Camry will come across the name Edward Lloyd. Because when he's coming along in the latter part of the 1600s, born in 1660, dying in 1709, he's writing things down. He goes alongside this great antiquarian movement, this great movement of understanding, the revolution of thought. No longer are the books that are being printed dominated by religious transcripts. They're now being dominated by what people thought of our history. Not just in Camry, but in the north, in the southeast, and the southwest. And this is not the only guy who's writing things down. There's a chap by the name of William Wynne, who's publishing a book in 1697 called The History of Both Nations as Well as the People is United. And he's talking about the English and the Welsh. And actually he's talking more than just the English and the Welsh. He's including the Scots there as well. Because there's a great interest in the sense of Britishness. Because by 1697, you haven't got the Darien expedition yet, but what you've got is a joint monarchy. King William of Orange, who is the King of Scotland and the King of England. And we're not using the word Wales, because Wales had been absorbed by England. So I know some of you have heard this before, and you hear it today. Wales, as the word in its right context and not the word Camry, is a province, a large county of England. It's never really been recognised as a country. We don't have our independence, but away from nationalism. Listen to this. What people thought, even those from our land, they thought of their own country as a joke. Jokes about the poor taffy were abound in English taverns and coffee houses, and caricatures of Wales as the fag end of creation, and a country in the world's backside flowed from the printing presses. This is what people thought of our land, Camry. The English hated the Welsh, or the English didn't respect the Welsh. Back in 1651, If you go to Oxford and Cambridge, you would like people to forget the place of birth. But slowly but surely, the historians are now starting to think in a different way after the 1650s, like Edward Lloyd. Gentlemen who would once proudly call themselves ancient Britons were now self-styled true Englishmen, or writing the new story and spirit of the land of the Welsh. Since the happy incorporation of the Welsh with the English, you can naturally call yourself true Englishmen. I think you know what I'm trying to say there. Historian William Wynne, in a moment. There it is. William Wynne's work. William Wynne, like Edward Lloyd, wished now to change the balance. One of the ways to change the balance was to obtain a sense of Britishness. Because Edward Lloyd and the likes of William Wynne, and more in the case of Edward Lloyd, were going around the country recording histories. And Peter, you know what I'm going to say, Peter, recording languages before they're lost forever. More about that soon. William Wynne, in 1697, The History of Both Nations, as well as the People is United. A mood of deep pessimism prevailed at the end of the 1600s, and it was widely felt that Wales was in great danger of losing its literary basis and its history inherited, and that was going to be lost forever. So these historians felt they needed to do something. They needed to save Cadwalder, the king. They needed to save Llywelyn, the prince. They needed to save a short account of the affairs of Wales under the kings of England. Caradoc, that name. And now people would no longer have a sense of pessimism. They wouldn't be in danger of losing the literacy of Camry. They would now inherit it and write about it. The inheritance had to be sealed, folks. This is a revolution. Lots of these books are in our great library at Aberystwyth. And look at that word there. Celts, Gauls, ancient Britons. But I need to explain that in more detail soon. There was no longer to be a calamity. Books poured from the presses. The culture of print helped to disseminate knowledge and create new expectations. In lots of ways, we are re-understanding the lands and countries of Britain, but some of it in some ways is being invented, which is quite sad, really. There is one thing to be said, that the Hanoverians, the Prince of Orange, and all those new crown princes and so on from Europe are coming into our land that they don't understand. William of Orange, he was from the continent. And one of the things they were saying to William of Orange was that we've got a great culture, and he would be saying, what? And they would be saying, oh, well, we got this. And he'd be saying, go out there. Let's learn about this. Let's learn about this, these poor old taffies. Let's learn about the country in the world's backside. Let's learn about these things. Let's learn about Cornwall. I don't know anything about these places. Let's learn about Scotland. I don't know anything about these places. So people went out on a royal warrant to record this history. There were booksellers, bookbinders, subscription schemes. This was the way things were going on. Life across these nations was being stimulated. But certain parts of our history was being invented. Extra stimuli also helped the Welsh to bestir themselves. Interesting word, bestir. In 1703, a Paul Vez Perron, a patriotic Breton monk, exercised an important influence on the growth of Celtic consciousness. In other words, the name Celtic would be synonymous with the rebirth of Camry, Breton, and Cornwall. It's a word that has an invention in 1703. It's an umbrella word used for those Celtic fringe people. It's not a word that would be associated in the past. It's a new word that was being brought in to give identity to those poor old Cornish and to give identity for those poor taffies. Publication written by a Frenchman, L'Antique de la Nation et de la Language des Celtes. Indeed, his wild and vivid stories about Celticism and the Celtic languages proved much more popular than the sober, comparative approach favoured by Edward Lloyd. Now, this is rather interesting. There was Edward Lloyd on the one hand, who wished to see history as it should be seen, and there were the likes of our Frenchman, a Perron, that wished to give a new light to these people, to sort of bring words like Celtic into people's tongues, in lots of cases for the first time. Edward Lloyd, the supremely gifted Oxford-based Welsh polymath, whose Archaeologia Britannica in 1707 grouped and classified the Celtic languages later on. Now, some really interesting stuff here, which I'll read out, and I'm just double checking another page. Oh, that lovely bit there as well. We've got to do that, I think. Maybe. Here we go. There's another publication coming up. Edward Lloyd, being a bit of a polymath, bit of an expert in lots of things, identified a certain type of fossil, a trilobite. Lloyd died within 2 years of the publication of this magnum opus, his wonderful work, The Archaeology of Britain. Robbed of his wise guidance, the Welsh took refuge in speculative fantasies and myth-making, which reached its epoch with the writings of Morgana, which we'll do in season 3. In 1716, there was a literal advance in invention, the inventions of Arthur and the Celts and so on. There was a publication that came of age in 1716, and we'll mention this now in its own context. Before we go look at that, now, when I was doing my research today, in my book, Wales, An Illustrated History by Priest Morgan, the first page I flicked at was this. You know, I saw this and I thought, this is Edward Lloyd. Edward Lloyd, I know some of you want the spelling. It's L-H-U-Y-D, L-H-Y-U-D. It's not Cloyd, L-L-O-Y-D, L-H-U-Y-D. And I thought, right, this is brilliant. It's really, really helped me, this did. And that's what he looked like. There you go. He's everywhere, isn't he? He's an Oxford Welshman. He's a Shropshire Welshman. Edward Lloyd. He died at the age of 49, so he didn't really get to expand what he could tell us and his understanding and writing down the true histories. And Peter, you'll be glad you joined us tonight. Edward Lloyd wrote about Cornwall. He also wrote about something very important, Peter, that could have been lost forever. He pried into every hole and corner in Scotland, Camry, England, and Cornwall in 1700. And we got slight delays with the thingy a minute. Okay, there we go. There's his other book. These are all obviously reprints. Edward Lloyd and the Scottish Highlands. You know, he's involved in writing so many publications. And if you'd have just lasted a bit longer, we could have understood what he meant by the word Celtic from the other writer, who was the Perron chap. You know, he could have told us a bit more. His understanding was eventually lost forever. There's Edward Lloyd. You know, the typical late 1600s gentleman. But that is where we're going to go briefly now. Translation of this: Through the Ages. Droich e priv osoedd. Through the Ages, or Our Eyes Through the Ages, our look at the ages. This was a book that was published by a certain Mr. Evans, a Theophilus Evans. This was a Welsh history book. And this achieved great literary status beyond that of Edward Lloyd, because Edward Lloyd was writing about Britain. So the first Welsh history book was being written by Theophilus Evans. In this publication, stoutly defended the legend of the Trojan origins of the ancient Britons, as peddled by Geoffrey of Monmouth in 1136. Actually, it may have been a Welsh history book, but it was also a lot of fiction in it. So this would have been very different from what the likes of Edward Lloyd was wishing you to learn about. So peddled by Geoffrey of Monmouth, and also celebrated the native language by linking it to the account in the book of Genesis of the peopling of the world. Here is the blood and race of the old Welsh. So in other words, the lineage of the Welsh came from the Holy Land. Now, I don't really go with that. However, one thing I would say is that we've got two big schools of thought. We've got a reinvention of Camry, and we've got the work that Edward Lloyd was trying to do. So we've got those two vast contrasts. Do we look at the real history of Camry, or do we look at the invented history of Camry? Do we look at the real history of Cornwall, or do we look at the invented history of Cornwall? And there was those two big schools of thought. And even today, there's that balance between King Arthur and Guinevere and the Trojans and all the rest of it, which most historians in their right mind and archaeologists don't go with. And there's people like me that like to go with what is tangible, what is really, really out there. So what we see is that moreover, Edward Lloyd was wanting to give us a genuine history. And that's where the Illicit Pillar comes into it. And that's where the big issue of another language comes into it, which we'll come on to. Despite everything that we said, there were already many signs of change before 1750. What was really happening, even with or without the scholarly fiction or fact, it was now become understood that the Wales and Welsh actually had a real history. You know, dictionaries and grammars of Welsh began to appear. Scholars such as Edward Lloyd showed that Welsh was not gibberish. So by 1750, even though we got people writing about Arthur and all these other things, right, people were actually thinking, actually, there's some real history of Camry. And strangely enough, how dare we think that there was even medieval Welsh laws? Those laws of Lhuyd, for example, in the 940s, and then we look at Rhodri Mawr, and you start to see that we don't have an invented history at all. You can have an invented history if you want, but you can have a real history if you go to the work of Edward Lloyd. When we, for example, look at Morgana in about 6-7 weeks' time, when I talk about Morgana, I talk about a figure who does both. Morgana, Edward Williams, Cowbridge, links with Lansford Major and all the rest of it. Morgana is half and half. He likes to do a lot of fiction, but he likes to do a lot of fact, like Edward Lloyd. So it's really difficult to understand the facts from Morgana's work, but I can see them. And look at his signature by Edward Lloyd. Your most obliged humble servant, Edward Lloyd. I like it. That's his own signature. So that must have been done before his death, and probably about 1700. Next, folks, we're going to look at the Illicit Pillar. Now, I've got you with me, Pat. You didn't go on a little trip to North Wales, did you, to see the Illicit Pillar?
I don't think so.
No. But you're going to learn about it now.
Good.
The Allistic Pillar itself. Now, it's a very strange monument. You can imagine that is Edward Lloyd with his family around him, and they're looking up at this stone. And now that's like, it's not as big as that. I've seen the Allistic Pillar. It's you know, I could probably put my arms around it and not just quite touch, but it looks much bigger there. It's much smaller, quite a bit of an exaggeration there. Where is the Illicit Pillar? The Illicit Pillar is, my folks, there it is. So above Oswestry, this side of Offa's Dyke, and the Illicit Pillar is magic in itself. And the Illicit Pillar is, thanks to Edward Lloyd, is a monument that was saved. Unfortunately, in his day, in the late 1600s, there were lots of carvings on it. There was, you know, there were carvings from the 900s on it. It was a great pillar, right? Now it's been completely, all the lettering has been eroded away. They have used technology to try and read something, but most of what was available to Edward Lloyd is no longer with us today to read. Illicit Pillar. The pillar is the broken shaft of the cross that gave the valley and the neighbouring abbey their names. It dates from the 800s and bears an inscription now barely legible, recording that it was erected in honour of Allistic, King of Powys. Now, when that was written, folks, that's about 60 to 70 years old, that there. And back then it was still legible. Now it's not. And it's quite a bugger of a monument to get to. You've got to park at the pub, and then you've got to run across the road in main road traffic, up a grass verge, into a muddy puddle, over a stile, across a muddy field, and there you go. You can see the mud there. And that is the pillar itself. It's very strange. It was never meant to be there, and it's part of a much larger monument, a much larger monument. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to look at my notes. So what have I got from my little notes today? So here we go. The Allistic Pillar stands near Valley Crucis Abbey. Wonderful set of remains. Again, that site was abandoned after the dissolution of the monasteries. It dates to the 1100s, probably the 900s, but it's a great monument. And the form Allistic, the form of writing on the pillar was very exquisite, and it was noted down by the wonderful Edward Lloyd. It was in Latin, it was, and the Latin inscription consisted of some 31 lines. It not only mentioned several individuals described in the Historia Brittonum, but also complemented the information presented in that text. Now, the Historiam Brittonum is a work written by a historian known as Ninnius. Now, we don't know when Ninnius was writing, but he may have been writing at the same time that this pillar was carved. So if we go from about the 900s, this is what Edward Lloyd transcribed down. He said as follows: generally, the translation of the inscription is accepted by experts, but we can't test it out. It's one of the longest surviving inscriptions from pre-Viking Wales. It goes as follows, if anyone can understand this. Concern, son of Catell, Catell, son of Brochmael, Brochmael, son of Allisig, Allisig, son of Goylach. And that Concern, great-grandson of Allisig, erected this stone for his great-grandfather Allisig. Now, this is great because it gives you a chronology of kings. It's like going to ancient Egypt and finding a complete, we could chuck our Chepsut in there. We can chuck Tutankhamun in there. We could put Ramesses, Setmos the Great, and all the rest of it. We'll put them in there, right? It was like finding something like this, but this is about the kings and princes of Powys. It describes, as it goes on, the same Allisig who joined together the inheritance of Powys throughout 9, we think, years, out of the power of the Angles with his sword and with fire. So he defeated those over the border. Whosoever shall read this hand-inscribed stone, let him give a blessing on the soul of Allisig. This is that Concern who captured with his hand 1,100 acres, 4.5 kilometers, which used to belong to his kingdom of Powys, and which the mountain, the monarchy, Maximus of Britain, Concern, Pasket, Man, and Annan. So basically, he's recapturing this territory. He's saying, look, I've beaten those damnable buggers over the border and I've got it back. It's great that we've got this, but you can't read it today. Brit, son of Vortigern. Now we go into it. We hear people like Vortigern. We think, oh, King Arthur, Vortigern, Saxon, whom Germanus blessed. That Roman, Roman church Christian that came over, Germanus, sometime in the 400s. And this is describing these. And who Saviour bore to him, daughter of Maximus the king, who killed the king of the Romans, Magnus Maximus. Now, Magnus Maximus marched on Rome in, I think it was about 386 or somewhere like that. I think that's about the date. He marched on Rome, Magnus Maximus. Now, from here, amazing. Conmark painted this writing at the request of King Concern. The blessing of the Lord be upon Concern and upon his entire household and upon the entire region of Powys until the day of judgment. So we've got a wonderful inscription there, but Edward Lloyd examined it and wrote it down. If it wasn't for Edward Lloyd, we wouldn't really be able to have any of this history written down. And to have things like this and absolute gems, and they're absolute gems because we don't know any other sources where this type of thing's complete. And you'll learn the word Brochmael and see what other association you can hear from Brochmael if you look the fella up. Anyway, that again. The pillar was thrown down apparently by the Roundheads during the Civil War. So this would be around 1646 or somewhere like that. And the grave upon it opened. So in other words, they buried it. They didn't want this thing to be seen, which probably preserved it for a while anyway. Edward Lloyd examined the pillar and copied the inscription in 1696. The lower half disappeared. So, oh, bugger me, we've lost a load of inscriptions. But the upper half was re-erected in 1779. The original inscription is now illegible. Now, I've never been sure whether the lower half was missing at the time of Edward Lloyd, or the upper and the lower half is where we get that inscription. And then, you know, part of it went missing. But nevertheless, we've got that there. So the site was examined, and the same, the site was examined in 2011 and 2010 and 2012, and it's positioned directly on top of a cairn, a kist burial, Bronze Age burial, and it was never ever meant to be there. It's been brought from somewhere else. Let's look at some more about these images now. So that gives you an idea of scale. It's not that sort of big, really. However, if we're talking about it, it's more like that. Hang on, if we look at this, I think this bit's gone, and this bit is there today. So that would make more sense to me, because it's not as big as that at all. Because when you look at the other images, which we'll do now, we go to, you can see it's not that big. So it must actually be just the top half that survived. So they excavated there, and this is what they think it looked like. So what we've got is, if we draw in there, we've got that bit left there on the site. Now, was Edward Lloyd's inscription that he read all of this, or was it in fact the top bit? Now, it was somewhere else. It may have come from Valley Crucis, but it'd been moved onto the site, and that's all we really know. Because I'm sure the Roundheads wouldn't have bothered going out into that field to knock it down if it had been there. It would have remained in situ, you know, and nobody would have bothered it, I think. So, and what we've got there, people have. That's not the original inscription. What the shame is that somebody has. I think this inscription is from the 1800s. Somebody's looks like they've over-inscribed the original inscription, which is mad, because you know, we've lost more of it. And they did use technology that you could use it using 3D imagery. You could actually read something, but it was really faint. And there it is again. So what we're going to do now, we're going to go on to the other issue. And the other issue is the Cornish language. If it wasn't for Edward Lloyd, the Cornish language would have disappeared forever, and it would not have survived. Edward Lloyd wrote the first Cornish dictionary. There were other people involved, but he's the one who's got the credit. And when I phoned up Peter earlier on, I said, have you ever heard of this guy? Does it mean anything to you? And Peter said no. And I just thought, oh, I thought myself, that's strange. But it wasn't strange, because in lots of ways, you know, even though Edward Lloyd put this dictionary together, the fine print is that there, and other people then put it into a printed dictionary and all the rest of it, and they got all the credit for it. But Edward Lloyd, what you can see is, you know, he's saying in Wales and in Scotland, literary significance, the fall of a letter. He talks some bits and pieces here, and he compares words at the bottom here. The word Abba, for example, is a British name, and then he goes into Caerweg, which is the Cornish dialect name for Cornwall back in the day. I know Peter's screaming, but write anything down that you want to do at the end, Peter. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to look a little bit. There you go, the Cornish Dictionary. That is in the British Library. You see the Cornish Dictionary. That's Edward Lloyd's Cornish Dictionary. It's amazing. It survived. His handwriting. This was because of him. This is his own original notebook. There he wrote the court. He went around. I got to tell you this now before I spoil it. Right. So let's just get into this. Just get straight into this. I found a wonderful text on this, and it goes as follows. Edward Lloyd, Welsh scholar, and his Cornish Dictionary. So a few things that we missed out about Edward Lloyd. Oswestry Grammar School, that's where he first went. His education. Jesus College, Oxford, 1682. So by the age of 22, he's at Oxford. Lloyd had a great interest in antiquities. That's what I want to do today, botany, geology. And shortly after going to college, he turned his attention to the experimental scientific work that was being conducted at the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford. He left the college before graduating and was appointed as one of the vice curators of the Ashmolean Museum, one of the oldest in Europe, and then as a curator in 1691. So he was well placed. We've mentioned Lloyd's work, the Archaeologia Britannica, an account of the languages, histories, and customs of Great Britain, from travels through Wales, Cornwall, Ireland, Scotland, and this came out in 1707. His attention was to include the Gair Coroig, which is the Dictionary of Cornwall, in the projected second volume of his work, and he announced his intention in the first volume. I find first that I must recall the promise made of a Cornish English vocabulary. I have one by me, written about 6 years since, and have lately improved it, with what additions I could, but there being no room for it in this volume, it must be deferred to the next. Oh my God, Peter, what happened? Edward Lloyd died in 1709 before he had the opportunity to prepare the second volume of the press. And Peter, he didn't go out and record the other stuff from the Cornish language, which is now lost forever. So that's the tragedy. He died young. Don't keep these things and not have them published. This is what I say. Anyone who's got a story out back there, just get out and do it. Gair Coroig. In 1702, Lloyd spent around 4 months in Cornwall, which is enough for any man, travelling from parish to parish in order to gather material for the Gair Coroig. During this time, he talked in the natives of the region. He talked to the natives of the region and recorded their vocabularies in a notebook. They were different from parish to parish, which is like North and South Camry. You know, it's different dialects. That, in essence, is the content of the Gair Coroig, namely a Cornish glossary with corresponding meanings in English. So we've got a dictionary. We've actually got a proper dictionary. As to its size, the Gair Coroig is a small notebook of 172 pages, with the glossary filling 162 of those pages. It was written in black and red ink in Lloyd's own handwriting. It contains a large number of corrections and several words have been crossed out. What does that mean? Oh. At the end of the volume, on page 164, elegy to the Cornish language to King William III, who died in 1702, has been added together with a Latin translation. So my God, we got Cornish, we got English, and we got Latin. Brilliant. Lovely stuff. Years after, like the Rosetta Stone I was thinking of, years after Edward Lloyd's untimely death in 1709, the manuscript became part of the personal collection of Sir John Williams, the main benefactor of the National Library. He presented the volume among his collection to the library in 1909. Can you imagine, right? If Sir John Williams's library had gone up in flames, that dictionary would never have survived. You know, there's so much out there that's been lost because they weren't printed and they weren't published. You know, it's so important. I'm a victim of this myself. I've got so much. This is why I'm not doing any archaeological field work for some years, because I've got to get my stuff out there. By today, Lloyd is considered to be one of the most versatile scholars that Wales has ever seen, and realistic, humanist scholars. He is respected for all the research work that he undertook to collect information about the Celtic languages and their interrelationship, and his work on the Cornish language is one of the few studies of the language that was undertaken at that time. So Peter, you know, I was amazed. I thought, right, you know, I can't make this up, you know, brilliant. Let's give him a call, tell him about it. So, you know, this is so, Edward Lloyd is just such an important figure, you know, in his level of projection of understanding. You know, there's so much out there, and you know, if you can get anything by Edward Lloyd from Amazon and so on, it's well worth it. Go out there. Just a few other things. The other thing as well is Edward Lloyd was responsible for the first scientific description and naming of what would now be recognized as dinosaurs. The sauropod tooth. And you know, this is a guy who's responsible for so many groundbreaking starts in science and understanding, and you don't hear about him. You know, I only come across him because I come across him a lot, but if you're not looking for him, you're not going to come across him at all. So what I would like to do is say I'm going to go over a little bit today, not too much. I would like to do Rhodri Mawr, or I could do yeah, we will do Rhodri Mawr because that's what I said I would do. But this is that book. This is his notebook. There you go, Cornish Dictionary. This is a notebook in his own hand. And this was in the library of Sir John Williams. So that was over 100 years ago, the foundation of the National Library. And that's his own writing. You know, that's his own vocabulary, that's his own writing. Can't understand a word of that. And I think that might actually be vocabulary. Yeah, that might be his Latin text that he wrote down. And look at that word there, archaisos, which ax mon the groin. This is his direction. And you know, if only he would have lived a bit longer, we would have had a second dictionary. We would have had all this published, and it would have been so wonderful. But it didn't happen. And but we've got to be happy with what he did. Benir, a Cornish word there. Berdir and Benagois. All sort of Welsh sounding words, because the Cornish language is very similar to Welsh. And going through it, there it is. It's like one of those old fangled things you used to have when we were in school. Actually, if you go on the internet, folks, if you go on the National Library of Wales if you go on their internet site, you can read the whole dictionary. You can read the whole thing. It's there. You go page by page. It's 150 odd pages, but you can go through every single page, and you can do that. So if anyone really interested in that, if they type in, what did I type in? If you type in, I know Pete's going to really want to know about this. So if you type in Edward Lloyd, Welsh scholar, Cornish dictionary, it'll take you to a page, and it'll take you to a link. The Library of Wales discovered digital library manuscripts. It's got the whole thing in there. I've never seen anything like that before, that you could actually read a whole book. But you can read the whole book online, and that's Edward Lloyd's own work, and it's absolutely great. If I had a bit more time, I'd go through it all myself. So let's sort of finish with these images. Let's sort of go through these. So there's the sauropod he discovered and so scientifically named. So, you know, I want to do Rhodri Mawr now. There was so much more I could have said about Edward Lloyd. Is there any point that springs to mind with you, Pat, that you'd like to say about Edward Lloyd, and anything that stands out?
Oh, just he was an amazing man. He knew so much and had so much knowledge. And I like the idea he had a degree in botany as well, because I have a degree in botany.
Well, you and him would have got on well. Oh, and the other thing as well is he would have been very similar to your husband, because your husband's got a passion for Wales as well. So there you go.
Yes.
And languages, your husband. So very similar. He would have been the ideal man back in the 1700s. So what we're gonna do now, we're gonna sort of only briefly look at Rhodri Mawr, and if there's a big call, we will mention him again. And Rhodri Mawr, why are we showing Dynevor Castle? And why are we showing this map? So Rhodri Mawr is around in the 840s, 850s, 870s. He's Rodri the Great. He's around 100 years before Lhuyd. And did he have coins? I reckon he probably did, but we haven't actually found any yet. So let's sort of look a little bit about Rhodri Mawr. So here we go. Rhodri Mawr, we had the image of Dynevor. According to legend, the first Dynevor castle was built by Rhodri Mawr in the 800s. It is unavoidable that attention should focus on those Welsh rulers who extended their power over much of Wales in the centuries prior to the Norman conquest. They foreshadowed the attempts of the princes of Gwynedd in the 1200s to create a unified state, and they matched contemporary developments in England and similarly, but later developments in Scotland. So Rhodri Mawr in the 840s is presented as one who set a pattern for the future. He either ruled or by his personal qualities dominated much of Camry. So he's a figure that you may not have come across. He's called Rodri the Great. Now, only two figures in the history of Camry have been given that title Great. So you got Llewellyn ap Iorwerth, Llewellyn the Great, who's reigning, who dies in 1240. You got Rodri the Great, who's reigning in the 850s. He reigned from 844 to 878. So we had a continuity of reign of 34 years. Chroniclers of his generation hailed Rodri ap Merddin as Rhodri Mawr, Rodri the Great, a distinction bestowed upon two other rulers in the same century, Charles the Great of Charlemagne, who died in 814, and Alfred the Great, who died in 899. So what we're talking about is we got three great rulers. Rhodri Mawr was put aside, but put alongside, not aside, put alongside the great Charles, the great Charlemagne, the leader of the Holy Roman Empire in Europe, which is an empire that we never hear about in my lectures. And he was seen as equal to Alfred the Great of England. Now, you hear about Alfred the Great burning his cakes, but you don't hear about Rhodri Mawr burning his feet. I don't know where the feet came from. The three tributes are a similar nature, a recognition of the achievements of men who contributed significantly to the growth of statehood among the nations of the English, the Franks, the French and Germans, and the Welsh. So you've got these three figures. So we've got this great figure in history that we see and hear nothing about. Unfortunately, the entire evidence relating to the life of Rodri consists of very little in writing, yet he must have made a deep impression upon our nation. For in later centuries, being of the line of Rodri was a primary qualification for their rulers. So in other words, if you're a king of Gwynedd, you had to be related to Rodri. If you're going to be a leader in Powys, you had to be related to him somewhere. Until his death, Rodri was acknowledged as ruler of more than half of Camry, and his diplomacy and his influence spread across all our land. Rodri's fame sprang from his success as a warrior, That success was noted by the Ulster Chronicle, which I said at the beginning, the Ulster Chronicle, Ulster Annals. And we don't really know when that's being written. It was his victory over the Vikings. He defeated the Vikings. Oh, come on. Who defeats the Vikings? Oh, yeah, I forgot. Yeah, Alfred the Great, yeah. But who defeats the Vikings? This guy, yeah? He defeats the Vikings. And in 856, international acclaim is poured upon him. He's great. Wales was less richly provided with fertile land. It's very much always the same. And with the navigable rivers that attracted the Vikings. So the Vikings were attracted, but he beat them. Anglesey bore the brunt of attacks, and it was there in 856 that Rodri won his great victory over the Danes, much to the delight of the Irish and the Franks. I've got a message flashing through, so I'm going to read it. What's this message saying? Hang on, a bit of delay for me to read it. What's it saying? Sorry, have to leave. Dell, if you want to catch up the end bit, Dell, I will put this online. Sorry, have to leave. Scalded arm today. Nurse just come for dressing. Okay, Dell, I will see you tomorrow, Dell. You can hear the rest of the recording online, but we're nearly at the end. Hopefully that gets better, Dell. Carry on. It was not only from the west that the kingdom of Rodri was threatened. By becoming the ruler of Powys, his mother's land, he inherited the old struggle between the kingdom of Mercia. Although Offa's Dyke had been constructed in order to define the territories of the Camry and the English, this did not prevent the successors of Offa from attacking Camry. The pressure on Powys continued. After 855, Rodri was its defender, and he and his son, Goriad, were eventually killed in battle against the English in 878, which is a shame, right? But he was a great leader, and he died fighting. So Rhodri Mawr is a figure that needs to be remembered and given the credit where it's due. So what we'll do, a quick look at these images. So that's Dinevor. It's said that he built a site there well before anyone else building anything in like a castle in England or Camry. So these are Ulster Chronicles that we see mentions of Rodri. No idea when they're written. Obviously, he's conquering this territory: Gwynedd, Powys, Cesarlwg, Lloyd, and you've got influence over Bilth, Brecon, Glysoig, David, and Gwent. So we got this great influence. And just quickly look at the family tree of Rodri. He takes us all the way back, going all the way through. So we've got Rhodri Mawr, directly linked from Rhodri Mawr is Hywel Dda, Hywel the Good. So, you know, this is a guy going places, you know. This is a man who's to be remembered and celebrated. The crest of Rodri, the three dragons, actually, the three lions or the three dragons, well, I can't call them dragons, the three lions, that was the Gwynedd house crest until 1282 when they were finally defeated by Edward I. That may be Hywel Dda, but maybe Rodri looked the same. And finally, what we're going to say, one thing I'm going to add is we mentioned Iolo Morgana a couple of times tonight. And what I'm going to say is we will look at Iolo Morgana again, but it'll be in about 6-7 weeks, who will be a great contrast in a way to what we've mentioned about Edward Lloyd tonight. So what I'm going to ask now is, are there any questions from you, Pat, before I open it up to everyone?
I was just interested in that pillar. That was amazing, the pillar. And why didn't they make some sort of copy of it? I suppose they couldn't make a copy back then, like we do now.
Like a ribbon. Yeah, like a ribbon. It's great foresight, isn't it?
Yeah.
We do have Michele got an original book of Kathleen. Christian McLagan. She was a Scottish archaeologist, and Christian McLagan took ribbons in the late 1800s. But this is obviously, 200 years before. So, we didn't get around to doing that. So what we're going to do, we're going to unmute everybody. I don't know what's happened to Pete. I think he's turned into something. Right. So, Pete, what are your thoughts on what I've said about Edward Lloyd? Unmute everybody. I have unmuted everybody.
Yep.
Right.
No, you haven't, but now you have.
Yeah, go on, Pete.
Well, I think it's amazing, and I will try and get hold of the some of that book. It was interesting. The French book you brought up, where it says about the Celts.
Yeah.
And it said, and alternatively known as Welsh.
Yeah.
The Celts, and they said the alternative known as Galwa, which is the Welsh.
Yes. It's rather interesting that we've got all this stuff that's being written at the end of the early 1700s. I gotta say it, Pete. If these people weren't writing, recording Wales and Cornwall, you can forget anything about the Celts or anything. None of this would have been written down. You would have lost your language as well. And if things would have gone more extreme, we could have lost our language also.
Well, as a Welsh speaker, he quite obviously could understand the Cornish language.
Yes.
Now, when we were in a church in Gumballow, and on the pillar there was the Lord's Prayer written in Cornish. Now, my daughter, who was Welsh, and she'd learned Welsh in school, we were asking what's that, and she was able to read it because of her Welsh. So,
exactly. But nevertheless, those individual words that he wrote down, that's what's very important. And Pete, it's there. You can flick through every single page. What I'm going to do, Pete, stay on at the end, right? We'll cut the recording and I'll show you what to do. Goff, you got it as well.
Yeah. Thanks very much. That was very interesting. Very good.
Thank you. And next week, I'll ask everybody else, but next week we're doing inscribed stones. What about you, Bill?
Yeah, as editor of the newsletter of the Cymru Valley Historical Society, some years ago I included an article on Edward Lloyd's visit to Llangolwyd Parish in about 1790, I think.
Yes.
Around there. So that would indicate, well, obviously I had that from his original book. I can't remember where I got it from or where it was at the time. But presumably that indicated that Edward Lloyd went round most, if not all, parishes in Wales, doing the same thing, researching church histories and antiquities and castles and other dignitaries and the folklore, etc.
Yes, exactly.
So he was a precursor of Yola Morgana in that respect. He seemed to have gone everywhere.
And a precursor of Mary Trevelyan, who's also doing the similar thing in the 1800s, exactly.
Yeah.
Gillian, anything from you?
Where was he born?
He was born in Shropshire. Well,
you said he went to school in Shropshire.
Yeah, he went. No. Hang on a minute. That's really a miss of me just spouting that out. He obviously went to school in Shropshire. He was. Where's it saying? Actually, he was born in a place known as Loppington, Shropshire. But he was the illegitimate son of Edward Lloyd, but spelt the proper way, of Oswestry, and his mother Bridget Priest of Llan Saint. So technically he was English, but he's been adopted by the Welsh.
Right.
So anyway, Michelle's the same. So if you haven't got anything, what you want to say, Pat, before we dash? No, nothing else?
Yes. I have been to the National Library of Wales, and it was amazing. I really, really enjoyed that visit. I recommend anyone to go to the museum or, the library and see, because they've got special rooms with things preserved, and I'll go back again and see some of the things you were talking about. So I'll go back with more knowledge.
Yeah,
That'd be
exactly. So you'll be able to ask specifics. What I'm going to do, I'm going to see. Oh, it's working. Actually, guys, right? Instead of me just sharing this with Pete now, right? I'm gonna show you all. And if you all stay with me just 2 minutes, right? I'll just show you this now. This little wonder. I've never seen this never seen anything like this before. Is it screen sharing?
Almost. It's getting there. There it is.
Bingo.
Yeah.
There we go. Write the header down, Peter. As I'm just going to flick through this, write the stuff on the top down. There you go. Let's quickly go through it. That's the inscription from the original library of Sir John Williams. There's some writing in there, and he starts to discuss the letters. I'm not going to go through them all. We'll just go to C. Agos, familiar word to me. And we keep going. You know, it's all there, the whole thing.
Amazing.
It is amazing because you could actually sit down and think, I want to study this, and it is pretty clear if you've got a big screen. Arv, a weapon. Arv.
Arwenech is a street in Falmouth.
Thanks. But this is brilliant stuff. So anyone wanting to go on, it's library.wales, discover, library.wales/discover/digital-gallery/manuscripts. And then you've got early -modern, and what you're looking for is spelt GEIRLYER KYRNWEIG. So if you want any more information about that, I could actually send that as a link to everybody. So there you go. That would be best. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to call that a night. See those of you tomorrow and Friday and Saturday. And what are we doing on Saturday? We're doing a mixture of things on Saturday. So that should be fun. Anyway, have you all enjoyed tonight?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, very good. Excellent.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Good night.
You, Goff,
Good night.
Bill,
Hi,
Pat,
everyone.
Bye.
Good night. Good night, everyone. Good night.
Night.
Bye.
Goldstein, Bob Syth, no star.
No stop.
So
And those stars Cornish as well.
yeah, those bloody Cornish nick everything. So yeah, I'll tell you what, Pete. I'll send the link out to everyone. That'd be best.
Yeah, please do. Yeah,
All
right.
right. Well, he's gone. Anyway, take care, guys.